In 2005, in the case Kitzmiller versus Nova Area School District, Dr. Michael Behe of the Discovery Institute testified under oath that the human immune system was irreducibly complex and could not have arisen via evolution. He was presented with 58 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and several immunology textbook chapters documenting the evolution of the immune system, and he simply ignored them, claiming that they were, quote-unquote, not good enough. Behe's refusal to even consider the evidence was one of the main reasons why conservative, Bush-appointed Judge John E. Jones III ruled that intelligent design is not scientific. Unfortunately, this ruling didn't happen until after Geisler and Turek's book was published, so they never got a chance to learn from Behe's mistake. And again, even if they had a chance, would they learn from it? Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. We're continuing to look at their attempt in Chapter 6 to refute the theory of evolution, not realizing that God's failure to design evolution is exactly what we would expect from an imaginary creator whose inventors didn't know enough about biology and genetics to be able to imagine evolution. And their next argument against God's ability to create evolution is the argument from irreducible complexity. According to Geisler and Turek, quote, an irreducibly complex system is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning, end quote. And that part in quotes there is from Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, which Geisler and Turek describe as, quote-unquote, revolutionary. As Kitzmiller versus Dover makes clear, that's an overstatement. But still, this is the canonical definition of irreducible complexity, straight from its inventor, and I'm more than happy to use that as a basis for my critique. See, the thing about this definition is that it's actually an indictment of God's ability to think through a good design. Behe believes that there's many, many features of living organisms that pose a design challenge that God couldn't use evolution to solve. Just like we saw in our last video, creationists today is unwilling to imagine God doing anything that Bronze Age believers was unable to imagine him doing. The best Bronze Age believers could do is to imagine God magically poofing things into existence without being able to leverage any of the capabilities he'd already built into the laws of nature. And consequently, Behe wrote an entire book proving that the biological laws that he believes was designed by God is totally inadequate for the task of evolving what he calls irreducibly complex structures and processes. Behe, like most modern creationists, acknowledges that God must have created some kind of evolution, what creationists call, quote-unquote, microevolution, but he thinks it's a flawed and inadequate design, and he thinks he can give us several examples of how God's design for evolution fails. Now, of course, Behe himself would never put it in those terms. He's just fixated on tilting at the windmill of evolution, which he sees as being an enemy of the faith, to the point that he forgets it's also supposed to be part of God's design, according to his worldview. And that's one of the hazards of deciding beforehand what you want the evidence to say before you look at the evidence. The objective verifiable evidence is going to be consistent with itself on account of it's part of objective reality, which is self-consistent. But when you try and impose an arbitrary, predetermined conclusion onto the evidence, they ain't no guarantee of self-consistency, and you're more than likely to end up preaching things with the implications that contradict some of the other things that you're also trying to preach. And that's what Behe is doing here. He's so determined to prove that there's scientific evidence of God magically poofing things into existence that he forgets that God already has evolution at his disposal, according to creationist worldview. If God's design for evolution was good enough, no magic would even be needed. In order to make the magic necessary, Behe has to argue that God failed to come up with a good design for evolution. And let me just mention here that what I'm doing is an internal critique of irreducible complexity in the context of a creationist worldview. I ain't saying that God actually did design evolution. I'm just saying if and we hypothetically assume that God created evolution, like Behe does, we can see that Behe's argument is an indictment of God's abilities as a designer. And that's a big problem theologically, because modern scientists has figured out how to evolve organisms that have these so-called irreducibly complex functions. Ordinary men and women has solved a problem that God couldn't solve. And that means God ain't as good a designer as ordinary mortal men and women. The irony here, of course, is that if God was actually real, Behe wouldn't have any way to be sure that God didn't come up with the same solutions that the scientists found. Genesis says that God commanded the seas and the earth to bring forth life. It don't say how they went about obeying his command. So Behe can't know that the God of Genesis didn't design evolution in a way that would allow the seas and the earth to use evolution to obey his command. The only way Behe can know with absolute certainty that God didn't do anything that Bronze Age believers couldn't imagine is if God's a fictional character who's limited to doing only what fans of the story is willing and able to imagine. Imaginary characters, even omniscient ones, is strictly limited to doing the things that authors and fans is willing and able to imagine. So Behe can know infallibly and without any possible doubt that his fictional creator did not come up with a successful design for evolution, because Behe's part of the community that's imagining the story, and that's how the story goes. End of discussion. But back to Behe's actual argument. The flaw is that it assumes evolution can only work by adding one single feature at a time, and that ain't the case, as has been documented over and over again in the peer-reviewed literature. There's all kinds of alternative mechanisms for evolution that can achieve quote-unquote irreducible systems, not by building up to them from the bottom, but by collapsing other functions together to produce a new function. Kind of like building an arch, which would fall over if you removed any of the bricks. So you first build a scaffold and then get the bricks into a mutually supporting position and then remove the scaffold. And scientists have found multiple ways that this could work, even though we've only had the tools to do this kind of research for relatively few years. So any reasonably intelligent deity ought to be able to come up with similar solutions, given all of eternity to think about the problem, even if they wasn't supposed to already be omniscient. But according to Behe and Geisler and Turek, the Genesis creator failed to do so. That's our own goal, folks. Now, when Behe's book came out, there was any number of scientists who pointed out how natural scaffolds could produce apparently irreducible systems. And Behe's answer is twofold. Quote, 1, there's no evidence for such scaffolds, and 2, it actually complicates things for Darwinists. Namely, if these scaffolds do exist, then who keeps building them in just the right places? That would require intelligence. End quote. Now, if Behe had actually read any of the dozens or hundreds of peer-reviewed papers on the topic without ignoring what they said, he would know the answer to both questions. There's plenty of evidence that such scaffolds do exist and that they can and do evolve naturally from pre-existent systems. But Behe ain't willing to consider the evidence because it would show that his pitiful roadblocks was insufficient to prevent God from solving the problem using evolution. And, of course, the evidence does more than just that. It shows that no supernatural creator is even needed at all. But I like to phrase it in terms of Behe failing to thwart God's abilities as a designer, because Behe's a smug little bugger, and I know putting it in these terms will twist his knickers. I'm only a barely bearable atheist after all. Meanwhile, Geisler and Turek is done with Behe's takedown of God's skills as a designer and is going to move on to the last 3 creationist arguments that they're going to be making in this chapter. The next one being the argument against transitional forms. Quote, another problem that plagues the plausibility of natural selection creating new life forms is the fact that transitional forms could not survive. A creature that has the structure of half a feather has no ability to fly. End quote. And once again, Geisler and Turek is so smart they can think up a problem that God himself can't solve. Or at least an imaginary God can't solve it if the people who imagine him ain't willing to imagine him solving it. Life must be frustrating for imaginary gods. Well, Geisler and Turek is forgetting that evolution ain't an intelligent designer with a specific goal in mind. Their own presuppositions are coming back to bite them in the butt. They's imagining that the only way to get feathers is the way an intelligent designer would do it. He set out with the specific intentional goal of making feathers. They can't imagine arriving at feathers indirectly without any particular destination in mind. And that means that God himself can't design evolution in a way that would allow feathers to arise by an indirect pathway. I mean, it ain't all that hard to do. All you need is some intermediate structures that has some other useful function besides flying. Then you couple that with the fact that simple mutations can result in complex changes, and you've got a problem that an all-wise God could solve in his sleep. It's only imaginary gods like Geisler and Turek's God that would be stymied by this kind of problem. Next up, so-called molecular isolation. Quote, perhaps the Darwinists are right. It is possible that we have a common genetic code because we've all descended from a common ancestor. But they could just as easily be wrong. Perhaps we have a common genetic code because a common creator has designed us to live in the same biosphere. End quote. Or, maybe we all have common genetic code because space aliens from Arcturus flew in and zapped us all with genetic homogenization rays. Or maybe it was pixies waving magic wands to change our DNA to fit some kind of pixie standard of tidiness. But the next question is, which of all of these possibilities is the most parsimonious? Which one best fits the evidence without the need for assuming additional unfalsifiable entities? Because I think that first explanation there about common descent does the best job of satisfying Occam's razor. Plus, there's lots of problems with trying to claim that some designer was just repeating similar designs in order to fit critters to similar biomes. For one thing, a lot of that genetic code don't actually affect the shape and abilities of the animal. A lot of it don't do anything, and we verified that by deleting those sections to see if it changes the organism in any way, and it don't. Then there's what's called endogenous retroviruses, which is virus DNA that's got stuck in the DNA of the organism it infected and became part of the DNA of its descendants. It don't infect the organism, which is why natural selection don't eliminate it, but scientists have done experiments where they cut the viral DNA out to see if it can become infectious again, and it does. It is literally virus DNA stuck inside the organism's DNA. And there ain't no reason for a designer to copy all that non-functional and foreign DNA between organisms, unless you want us to say he's being deliberately deceitful and is trying to create a false impression of evolutionary descent. And my take on that is that if God worked so hard to convince us that we's all descended from a common ancestor, maybe we should give him the benefit of the doubt and believe in common ancestry. The problem here is that Geisler and Turek believe in a God who's too dumb to design an evolutionary system capable of producing the entire rich diversity of life out of only a single ancestral species. He can't do it according to the story they believe in. The people who originally invented that story couldn't imagine all life descended from a single species, and therefore the God that they imagined couldn't design biology in such a way as would allow that to happen. Again, its own goal. The fact that they even try to make this argument is evidence that they's preaching an imaginary God whose abilities and motives is limited by the imaginations of those who invented him. But there's more to this section than the argument from common design. They next bring up an argument by Michael Denton of the Discovery Institute that they call molecular isolation. It's a bit more technical than is typical for creationist arguments, and you can thank the Discovery Institute for that, but it ain't too bad. Quote, most proteins have in their structure more than 100 amino acids, which must be in a very specific order. It's the DNA that contains the instructions for ordering the amino acids in the proteins, and the order is critical because any variation usually renders the protein dysfunctional. End quote. And I added italics to that quote because, as we'll see in a minute, it's a very important part of their argument. Geisler and Turek is saying that any variation in the order of amino acids usually breaks the protein so it can't perform its normal function. and that's wrong. They're just saying it to create a false impression that evolution is fragile and that even trivial disruptions will shut the whole thing down. But what they're saying is factually incorrect, as we'll see in the next quote. Quote, all organisms share common genetic code with varying degrees of closeness, and that code has ordered the amino acids in proteins in such a way that the basic types are in oscillation from one another. End quote. And I'm skipping over the technical discussion, both because it's long and also because Geisler and Turek leave out some important details. But what we're talking about here is comparing the differences in the order of amino acids for a particular protein, like, say, cytochrome C, across different species of animals. Denton's argument, which Geisler and Turek is quoting, is that if common ancestry is true, then we ought to see a hierarchical structure in the amino acids of fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals reflecting their common descent, and we don't. And I'll get to the flaw in this argument in a minute, but first I want to go back to the quote where Geisler and Turek claimed that any difference in amino acid order would usually break the protein. And yet, what do we see? We see differences in amino acid order in the cytochrome C protein across multiple different species. That's how Denton proposes that we should compare them and look for evidence of common descent. And cytochrome C ain't just any old protein. It plays a vital role in cellular respiration, among other things. If your cytochrome C is broke, you gonna die. So the fact that different species has amino acids in different orders means that Geisler and Turek is flat out wrong. There's plenty of different orderings that works just fine in perfectly healthy cytochrome C proteins, and that's a good illustration of how robust and flexible evolution is. It ain't this fragile system constantly on the verge of collapse that creationists try to make it out to be. But back to Michael Denton. Now, the flaw in his argument is that modern amphibians ain't descended from modern fish, nor modern reptiles from modern amphibians, nor modern mammals from modern reptiles. The fact that multiple different orderings work interchangeably with other orderings means that these orderings is free to change over generations without any kind of deleterious effect. And that means that the ordering of amino acids ain't going to be conserved across millions or hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Any relationship between amino acid order in modern fish and the order that existed in fish at the time amphibians first evolved is going to be coincidental at best. Denton's basic assumption that different species will always have the same ordering is false, and therefore his conclusions is entirely meaningless. But hey, it sounds all scientific and technical and stuff, so Geisler and Turek know that it's going to impress their target audience. And as long as the audience finds it convincing, who cares whether it's actually true or not, am I right? Last but not least, Geisler and Turek's going to appeal to that primordial favorite of creationists, the so-called missing link. In fact, they's going to try and go one better. Quote, the main point here is that the fossil record actually lines up better with supernatural creation than with macroevolution. Indeed, there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain, end quote. Cue the clip from Futurama where Dr. Banjo keeps saying, what about this missing link? And Professor Farnsworth keeps saying, we found it, on into the night. Creationist audiences ain't likely to keep up with current advances in paleontology, so Geisler and Turek can get away with claiming that there's widespread systematic gaps between major families of organisms on Earth. But it's actually false, and the gaps that creationists appeal to is getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. And even if the fossil record didn't preserve every transition, the genetic record does. So it's a futile argument that just goes to show how resistant creationists is to learning anything that they don't want to believe. But it's more than that, because Geisler and Turek is essentially arguing that God failed once again. They admit that in their worldview he must indeed have created evolution, but they can't imagine him doing such a good job that his design for evolution would be capable of producing all life on Earth. They have to say he only created microevolution, and it ain't up to the job. It breaks down at some point, and God has to supernaturally intervene to start it going again. Bronze Age believers was able to imagine God magically poofing critters into existence, but they wasn't able to imagine a well-designed, powerful, elegant evolutionary system, and therefore the God they imagined couldn't create one. And creationists like Geisler and Turek has been dragged kicking and screaming into admitting that evolution is actually real, but they's limited by the imaginations of Bronze Age believers, and so they has to claim against all evidence that there must be clear, systematic gaps in the fossil records. And every time science finds a new transitional form, they feel compelled to say that this creates two new missing links, because they know infallibly and without any possible doubt that their God couldn't possibly have succeeded in building an innovative, robust evolutionary system. And of course, he couldn't. He's only an imaginary God. From here, Geisler and Turek goes on to try and address what they see as the skeptical and scientific objections to intelligent design, and that's a good place for us to stop today. There's a lot more that could be said, but there's YouTube channels out there that are saying it a lot better than me, and you can go check them out if you're interested. I personally enjoy The Dapper Dinosaur, Gutsick Gibbon, Creation Myths, and Forrest Valkai. And you can tell him I said hi if he wants to drop by and pay him a visit. I'll put links in the description. There's also Professor Dave, but you probably better bring your Kevlar undies if you're just going to watch him talk about creationism, because he definitely brings the heat. And of course, there's lots more. Feel free to put a link in the comments if there's any that you can recommend. I'm always happy to discover new content creators. Meanwhile, that's going to do it for me for today. Thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.